Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from United Christian Church of Austin, where no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're invited and welcome. Our sermon for today, Sunday, October 15th, 2017, is entitled, How Do We Love Our Enemies? It's a reflection on a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. Today's sermon is special. It's a reading of a sermon originally preached by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the same topic on November 17th, 1957, at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Let's listen for a fresh word from God in these words from Dr. King, reflecting on the gospel. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to learn more about our open and affirming ministry at United Christian Church, simply head over to our website, www.uccaustin.org. Thank you.
Our scripture reading today comes from the New Testament, from the Gospels, from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. These verses come from what we think of as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which most scholars believe forms the core of Jesus' teaching. Let's listen for what the Spirit may be saying to us today in these words from Matthew chapter 5. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your parent in heaven. For God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your parent in heaven is perfect. Beloved, God is still speaking to the world. May our hearts be open to listen and to respond. Amen.
So how many of you have been here for one of our instant sermon Sundays? Yeah, a lot of folks. For folks who haven't, this is something we do 3 or 4 times a year, where instead of Nikki or me or Carl preparing a sermon for you and delivering it, we actually take that time and respond to questions that come from you in the pews. People fill out slips of paper with their questions, put them into a basket, and we draw them out and we respond to those questions. We're very clear to say we don't answer those questions. We are responding to those questions. But of course, in the time that we have in worship together on Sunday, we're not able to get to all of them. So this past August, we took the leftover list of questions and turned it into a poll. So you, the family and friends of this congregation, could choose the top 3 questions that you would like to have responded to in a sermon. Lucky me, I chose the one that we have today. How do we love our enemies? And as I was thinking about this sermon, I realized that likely, if I was to say anything important at all, it would be more like a list of quotes of other and better preachers who have spent longer and better time reflecting on this, perhaps Jesus' hardest commandment for us. So I decided in for a penny, in for a pound, and went the whole 9 yards and found this sermon by a much better preacher, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who knows a thing or two in his time about how we love our enemies. It's a sermon he delivered on November 17th, 1957, to the folks gathered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And it is on our topic today, on how we love our enemies. And if you make just a very few substitutions, given the many decades in between, it's an eerily appropriate sermon, I think, for us today. Also, of all the preachers I can think of, this is one that I think we need to hear more from. Dr. King's legacy has been too often reduced to a matter of sound bites that we trot out on our Facebook feeds once or twice a year. But it's a wonderful thing to hear him more fully, to hear his humor and his earthiness his down-to-earthness as he confronts this, which he admits is one of the hardest things that Jesus asks us to do. So let's listen for a word from God in these words, reflecting on this passage from Matthew. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Certainly, these are great words. And over the centuries, many persons have argued that this is an extremely difficult command. Many would go so far as to say it just isn't possible to move out into the actual practice of this glorious command. They would go on to say that this is just additional proof that Jesus was an impractical idealist who never quite came down to earth. So the arguments abound. But far from being an impractical idealist, Jesus has become the practical realist. The words of this text glitter in our eyes with a new urgency. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, this command is an absolute necessity for the survival of our world. Yes, it is love that will save our world, love even for enemies. Now, let me hasten to say that Jesus was very serious when he gave this command. He wasn't playing. He realized it's hard to love your enemies. He realized it's difficult to love those persons who seek to defeat you, those persons who say evil things about you. He realized that it was painfully hard, pressingly hard. But he wasn't playing. And we cannot dismiss this passage as just another example of rhetorical hyperbole, a sort of exaggeration to get the point across. No, this was a basic philosophy of everything we hear coming from the lips of our Master. Because Jesus wasn't playing, he was serious. We have the Christian and moral responsibility to seek to discover the meaning of these words and to discover how we can live out this command and why we should live by these words. Now, first, let us deal with this question, which is the practical question. How do you go about loving your enemies? I think the first thing is this. In order to love your enemies, you must begin by analyzing yourself, strange as that may seem. Now, I am aware of the fact that some people will not like you, not because of anything you've done to them, but they just won't like you. I'm quite aware of that. Some people aren't going to like the way you walk. Some people aren't going to like the way you talk. Some people aren't going to like you because you can do your job better than they can do theirs. Some people aren't going to like you because other people like you. Some people aren't going to like you because your skin is a little brighter than theirs, and others aren't going to like you because your skin is a little darker than theirs. But after looking at these things and admitting these things, we must face the fact that sometimes an individual might dislike us because of some personality attribute we possess, or because of something that we have done deep down in the past and we've forgotten about it. That's why I say begin with yourself. There just might be something within you that arouses the tragic hate response in the other individual. This is true of our international struggle today. We look at the ideological struggle between communism on the one hand and democracy on the other. When we look at the methods of communism, a philosophy where somehow the end justifies the means, we cannot accept it because we believe as Christians that what we aim at and how we go about accomplishing it are of equal importance. But in spite of all the weaknesses and the evils inherent in communism, we must at the same time see the weaknesses and evils within democracy. Now, to my mind, democracy is the greatest form of government ever conceived, but its weakness is that we have barely tried it. Isn't it true that we have often taken necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the upper classes? Isn't it true that we have often in our democracy trampled over individuals and races with the iron feet of oppression? Isn't it true that through our Western powers we have perpetuated colonialism and imperialism? The success of other lesser forms of government in the world today is due to the failure of democracy to live up to the noble ideals and principles inherent in its own system. And this is what Jesus means when he said, "How is it that you can see the mote in your neighbor's eye and not see the beam in your own?" And this is one of the tragedies of human nature. So we begin to love our enemies and to love those persons who hate us, whether in collective life or individual life, by looking first at ourselves. A second thing an individual must do in seeking to love their enemy is to discover the element of good in their enemy. And every time you begin to hate that person and think of hating that person, realize that there is some good there. I've said to you on many occasions that each of us is split up and divided against ourselves. There is something of a civil war going on within all of our lives. There is something within all of us that causes us to cry out with the Apostle Paul, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." Within the best of us, there is some evil. And within the worst of us, there is some good. When we come to see this, we take a different attitude toward individuals. The person who hates you the most has some good in them. Even the nation that hates you the most has some good in it. Even the race that hates you the most has some good in it. And when you come to the point that you look in the face of every human being and see deep down within them the image of God, you begin to love them in spite of themselves. No matter what they do, you still see God's image there. There is an element of goodness they can never slough off. Discover that element of good in your enemy. And as you seek to hate them, find that center of goodness and place your attention there, and you will take a new attitude. Another way you love your enemy is this. When the opportunity presents itself for you to defeat your enemy, that is the time you must not do it. There will come a time in many instances when the person who hates you most, the person who has misused, gossiped about you, spread false rumors about you the most, there will come a time when you will have an opportunity to defeat that person, to hurt that person. That is the time that you must not do it. That is the meaning of love. In the final analysis, love is not sentimental, it's not emotional, love is powerful. It is a creative, understanding goodwill toward all persons. It is a refusal to defeat any individual. When you rise to the level of love, you seek only to defeat evil systems. Individuals who happen to be caught up in that system you love, even as you seek to defeat the system. This is the creative love of God working in the lives of human beings. And as you rise to love on this level, you begin to love people not because they're likable, but because God loves them. And they might be the worst person you've ever met. But this is what Jesus means, I think, when he says, love your enemy. And now it's significant that Jesus does not say, like your enemy. Like is something sentimental, something affectionate, but there are a lot of people I find it difficult to like. I don't like what they do to me. I don't like what they say about me and about other people. I don't like their attitudes. I don't like some of the things they're doing. I don't like them. But Jesus says, love them. And love is greater than like. Now let us move from the practical how to the theoretical why, because it's not only necessary to know how to go about loving your enemies, but also why we should love our enemies. I think the first reason we should love our enemies, and I think this is at the very center of Jesus' thinking, is this: hate for hate only intensifies hate and evil in the universe. If I hit you and you hit me and I hit you back and you hit me back and on, you see this goes on ad infinitum. It just never ends. Somebody somewhere has got to have a little sense. And that's the strong person. The strong person is the person who can cut off the chain of hate, the chain of evil. And that is the tragedy of hate, that it doesn't cut off hate. It cannot. We must see that force begets force, that hate begets hate, toughness begets toughness. And it's all a descending spiral, ultimately resulting in destruction for all and everybody. Somebody must have sense enough and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate and evil in the universe, and you do that by love. There's another reason why you should love your enemies. It's because hate distorts the hater. We usually think of what hate does to the hated, but it's even more tragic, more ruinous and injurious to the individual who hates. There is nothing more tragic than someone whose heart is filled with hate. They can't even see straight. When you stand up in hate and see a person, a beautiful person, you'll call them ugly. When you're a person who hates, the beautiful becomes ugly and the ugly becomes beautiful. The good becomes bad and the bad becomes good. The true becomes false and the false becomes true. That's what hate does. Hate destroys the very personhood of the hater. Hate is a cancer that gnaws away at the very vital center of your life. It's like eroding acid that eats away the very best of you. So Jesus says love because hate destroys the hater as well as the hated. Now there's a final reason I think Jesus says love your enemies. It's this. Love has a redemptive power. A power that eventually transforms individuals. That's why Jesus says love your enemies. Because if you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem and transform your enemies. But if you love your enemies, you will discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. You just keep loving people. And you keep on loving them, even though they're mistreating you. Here's the person who is a neighbor who has done something wrong to you and all that. Just keep being friendly to that person. Keep loving them. Don't do anything to embarrass them. Just keep loving them. And they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways in the beginning. They react with bitterness because they're mad that you love them like that. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more in that transition period. But just keep loving them, and by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. That's love. You see, it's redemptive. And this is why Jesus says love. There's something about love that builds up and is creative. But there is something about hate that tears down and is destructive. So love your enemies. That's it. There is power in love that our world has not discovered yet. For they believe in hitting for hitting, and an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, and hating for hating. But Jesus comes and says, this isn't the way. This morning I think about how our world is in transition now. Our whole world is facing a revolution. Our nation is facing a revolution. And one of the things I hope for most is that in the midst of this revolution, we will discover the meaning of Jesus' words, Jesus' way of love. History, unfortunately, leaves some people oppressed and some people oppressors. And there are three ways that individuals who are oppressed can deal with their oppression. One of them is to rise up against their oppressors with physical violence and corroding hatred. But this isn't the way. For the danger and weakness of this method is its futility. Violence creates more social problems than it solves. And I've said in so many instances, if we succumb to the temptation of using violence, even in the struggle for justice, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness. And our chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. Violence isn't the way. Another way is to acquiesce and give in, to resign yourself to the oppression. Some people do that. They discover the difficulties of moving from the wilderness into the promised land, and they would rather go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. And so they resign themselves to the fate of oppression, but that too isn't the way, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. I'll say that again. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. But there is another way, and that is to organize mass, nonviolent resistance based in the principles of love. It seems to me that this is the only way. As our eyes look to the future, we must discover the redemptive power of love. And when we discover that, we will be able to make this old world new again. Love is the only way. Jesus discovered that. Yes, I can see Jesus walking around the hills and valleys of Palestine, and I can see him looking out at the Roman Empire with all of their fascinating and intricate military machinery. But in the midst of all that, I can hear Jesus saying, I will not use this method. I will not hate the Romans. I will overcome hate with love. This is the only way. And we must discover this as a civilization and as individuals. The cross of Christ is an eternal reminder to a power-drunk generation that love is the only way. It is an eternal reminder to a generation depending on weapons, even nuclear weapons, a generation depending on physical violence, that love is the only creative, redemptive, transforming power in the universe. So this morning, as I look into your eyes, and into the eyes of all of my neighbors here and all over America and all over the world, I say to you, I love you. I would rather die than hate you. And I'm foolish enough to believe that through the power of this love, somewhere, persons of even the most recalcitrant bent are being transformed. And then we will be in God's kingdom. Because we have the power to love our enemies, to bless those persons who cursed us, to even decide to be good to those persons who hated us, when we even prayed for those persons who despitefully used us. Oh God, help us to work out this foundational force of love, this power that can solve every problem we confront in all areas. We talk about politics. We talk about the problems facing our nuclear civilization. Oh God, grant that all human beings will come together and discover that as we solve this crisis and solve these problems, the international problems, the nuclear problems, and yes, even the problems of racism, let us join together in a great fellowship of love and bow down at the feet of Jesus. Oh God, give us this strong determination. In the name and spirit of Christ we pray. Amen.